Well, hello, friends and journeyers. Welcome back to Honoring the Journey. Today is going to be so much fun. I'm like so excited. Of course, you know what? This is my first interview that I've done since I took my break all through December. So I'm like really excited. You know, when you take a break and you come back and you're like, yeah, I can just do this. I feel like Superwoman. So I'm really excited. And not only to do the interview, but because of who it is. This guy's name is Josh Scott, and he is a pastor and a writer. And I believe he's known as a heretic. Welcome to the family. And yeah, it's so funny. I got to tell you, I'm going to introduce him in a little bit, but I got to tell you something really fun. Last year, I want to say it was April, I bought his book, Context, which is putting scripture in its place. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But I bought his book because I had heard that it was really good. And I was like, I'm going to go read this. I'm trying to learn and deconstruct how I really feel about the scripture. Um, and I loved that he was a pastor, you know, because sometimes you get people who are like really jaded and angry and don't want anything to do with church, you know, like me sometimes. But I need balance in my life. So I was like, this is great. Okay. So I get the book. I'm kind of, you know, reading through it and then watching him online. I'm like, oh my gosh, this guy's amazing. I really like him. And then we go to Italy on a trip, me and my husband back in October, I think. And there he was on CNN, like doing an interview in Venice, Italy. He wasn't in Italy, but I was in Italy watching him on CNN talk about stuff. And I was like, okay, it's a sign. So I let him know that I saw it. Josh, was that the coolest thing when I was like, you're in Italy?
Yeah, it was. I mean, I wish I was in Italy. Actually, in Italy, that sounds like it was incredible.
Yeah, it was pretty
Um,
great.
yeah,
Yeah, that's so fun. So he was on a special on CNN about deconstruction, about, you know, people leaving the church and just you did such a great job, Josh. I'm so happy to have you here. Welcome to Honoring the Journey.
thank you so much for having me. I appreciate your work so much, and it's a real honor to be here.
Well, thank you. So, okay, I like to start things off really lighthearted and fun. So, I'm going to ask you a random question just to get to know you as a human being, not as a pastor. I mean, like, take off all the hats that you wear. Just be Josh, okay? So, if you could sit down for dinner with anybody in the world, dead or alive, who would
Oh,
you sit down with? What would you ask? What would you want to talk about? And why?
I mean, so the thing I love the most, like that I enjoy more than probably anything, and if you said take the pastor hat off, even if I take the pastor hat off, the thing I love the most is like historical research into early Jesus movement stuff.
Yes.
So there's part of me that wants to just give sort of the expected answer, which is like I would love to talk to somebody who was around in the beginning to say like what
Mhm.
actually happened.
Yeah.
What was it like? So whether it's Jesus or Paul or Mary Magdalene or somebody like that, I think that would be pretty cool. Otherwise, This is embarrassing, but I'll admit it
No,
out loud
no, do
because
it.
I
Do it.
think we have so little in common. But in the '90s, when I was growing up in high school, I was a huge fan of Stone Cold Steve Austin. And I think I would love to have a beer with him and just hear stories from big time professional wrestling in the '90s.
Okay, wait a minute. Wait a minute. We may have something fun to talk about here, Josh. Did you know I
Okay.
used to work for Ric Flair?
I didn't know that. No.
Yeah, I ran
Nature
the
Boy and
group
Fat?
fitness. He had 3 gyms, gold gyms in the Charlotte area, and I ran his group fitness program. So we
Oh,
would go to his Christmas party every year, and my husband was so geeked out every year because it was just tons of these guys who I had no idea who they were. I didn't even know who he was.
I'm so jealous.
Yeah, it was the
That's
coolest
incredible.
coolest season of my life. He was so fun. And his son, um, David, I believe is his name, he
Mhm.
used to help out in the nursery and he would like throw my kids around in the nursery and they loved him. It was so fun. So yeah, small world. We both kind of, well, you like the wrestling world and I just worked with it.
Um, I'll tell you how bad it was when we got our first. I think I was a senior in high school,
Uh-huh.
and they made us go to the library and sign up for an email,
Mhm.
which I thought was the dumbest thing in the world and would never catch on. I remember thinking, like, I can't believe they're wasting our time with this.
Yeah,
Nobody's
this
ever
is
going
so
to do
dumb.
this.
So stupid. Who's going to do
Um,
that?
my first email address was stonecold87 at hotmail.com. Not because I was born in '87, I was born in '81. But because there were like 87, 88 other people who were trying to get the Stone Cold at Hotmail email address. So that's pretty embarrassing now, but at the time it was the
No, I think
coolest.
it's great. I mean, but you know what? We all have our passions and we all have our heroes, and I think that's pretty fun. And that makes you very human, and I love that. Thank you. And I love the Jesus answer. Of course, we all want to sit down with him. But I love that you said Mary Magdalene. I just
Yeah,
love that because there's so many different perspectives that we can look into, which I'm sure we'll get into. But so as we get started for the episode, I really just want to hear, like, if you could take us back, like, let's hear your journey from, when you can remember. And did you grow up in church? Was your family religious? Like, what did that look like? And how did you get to where you are now?
that's woo,
I
that's a
know. Here you
um,
go.
so I grew up. I'm from Appalachia. I'm from a little town on the Kentucky West Virginia border. So I kind of grew up with dual citizenship. My dad was from the West Virginia side of the river. My mom was from the Kentucky side of the river. And I grew up in a holler. And if your listeners aren't sure what that is, just imagine there's a mountain and people find coal in it. And so they bore a hole in it
Yeah.
to mine it. And then people move there. And so I grew up, about 3 miles up a holler in an Appalachian town. And we were Free Will Baptist was the tradition I was born into, which I think Appalachian Free Will Baptist is different than other Free Will Baptists that I've encountered. It was the word I use for it is pneumatic, meaning it was a very spirit driven. So my grandfather was the pastor, but you would show up every week and you didn't know what songs were going to be sung, who was going to sing a special music. You didn't know who was going to preach. This would all like, it's sort of like when you watch those cooking videos where they're making it right in front of you. It was that kind of experience. And so some weeks my grandpa would preach, some weeks, he'd say, we're going to sing one more song. Then brother so-and-so is going to preach, and brother so-and-so would get out this cartoonishly large Bible and just start looking for anything any kind of jumping
His
off point.
brother so and so didn't know he was going to be preaching.
No, he didn't. But that's why you
I
always
love
have
it.
to be prepared,
Johnny on the spot. Yes.
right?
Yes.
And I grew up in that. The year I turned 12, it was the summer before I turned 12. It was a really hard year for our family. We lost maybe the two people closest to me in the world. We lost my great grandmother, and then my grandfather, who was the pastor. He passed away in a church business meeting
Oh gosh.
right
Wow.
after right after somebody told him he was the problem and needed to leave. And he had a heart attack, and it was just I don't know if any of your listeners have ever followed comics, but in every telling of the Batman story, there's a crime alley, which is like where his story begins. And I always
Mhm.
think that's my story of who I became. Really started being there for that and seeing that happen, and just starting to ask questions. When people say, "When did you start deconstructing?" It was like the summer of '93 for me,
Hmm.
because that was the summer when I grew up under a sacred canopy where everything made sense.
Mhm.
Good things happen to good people. God blesses the people who try hard and do good things and all that. And then sort of all the holes got poked in that, and I just could no longer buy so much of it. And I didn't know I couldn't buy it. I just knew at the time. At the time, I didn't know atheism was an option.
Hmm.
They'd never told me that. Um, God was assumed. And so I knew there's a God, but it's kind of a jerk, and I want nothing to do with
Mhm.
this God. Which led to, eventually I was right there in that preteen. By the time I was a teenager, my parents, I think, had the sense that they were losing me religiously, and so they moved us to the Hatton Church in town, which had the coolest youth group, which was Southern Baptist Church. And it was a liberal move for us.
Yeah. That's
Conservative
funny.
Baptist are. We were leaving behind King James
So
only,
liberal. Oh
Lucy's
wow.
Foundation, like your car keys. Like, we were leaving behind all of that.
Yeah.
And so, I got plugged into the youth group and somehow became a leader, which is, I still am not sure how. I was a shy kid, really, really unsure of myself. Did not want to be front and center or put on the spot. But our music minister asked me one night, maybe I was 15 or 16, probably 15. He said, our pastor's out of town X Sunday night. We're doing a youth service. Would you like to give a little sermon, a little devotional? And I was like, I didn't want to, because there was this sense in me where, I conflated my grandpa's experience to the church will kill you,
Mm.
you know. But I
Wow.
also was a people pleaser. And so I said yes immediately and spent the better part of a month just hoping to catch the stomach virus that weekend and not be. Very few times have I prayed on my face in my bedroom, Lord, please inflict something on me. I don't want to do
Strike
that.
me with an illness.
Not
Oh my
anything.
word. I don't wanna say no, so I'd rather throw up and be miserable than
Right,
say no. Yeah,
right,
that sounds about right. That's a very, very churchy answer.
right. And the service came and I gave an 11-minute sermon on John 3:16, which I totally
Mhm,
disavow.
mhm.
Now, but it was just this moment where I felt like, gosh, I don't know what that was, but I need to try that again. And
Nice.
then started on the preaching circuit when I was 15. So got my license at 16, started preaching all over. I'm from the biggest county in Kentucky, so you could drive for hours. And I had so many horrible preaching gigs as an early, preacher. And, just through that time would say things in sermons because I just they're true. I just think they're awful. Um, I mean, this doesn't seem like actual good news, but I guess it's the truth. So I have to say it anyway. And that's, late teens, early 20s is when I started realizing there's a whole other world of theology out there that completely wrecked me in the best possible way.
Yeah.
And to your
Man, I
point, I
can
went through some angry times too. Like I was
yeah.
an angry pastor preaching angry sermons, not about sinners going to hell, but about religious people. There were some sermons I'm glad that were on cassette.
Yeah, I was never a preacher, obviously, because 'cause I'm a woman. But I was I did do a lot of speaking engagements, and I remember people saying, "Well, why don't you just talk about hell? You need to talk about hell." And I'm like, "I really hate that." I don't like the notion, and I know that it's true, because that's what the Bible says, but I just can't like, I feel like when we bring that up, we're dangling people over we're like coercing them into doing something that doesn't that seems I don't know, like it was one of those moments where I think I realized my head and my heart weren't connecting
Yeah.
and something seemed off. So I know exactly what you're talking about. Like it's really like, okay, this is the truth, but dang it,
Yeah.
I'm just going to focus on the good parts, because
Yeah, and,
it
you
doesn't
know,
make sense.
people say this a lot to me around, specifically around LGBTQ plus
Yeah,
inclusion, but really around hell too, which is, if it were up to me, that's not how it would be. But I'm not
exactly.
God, and God's ways are higher than ours. And I
Yes.
just want to say, okay, so let's just begin with this. You're
Mhm.
saying if it were up to you, you would do something better than God is doing. I think that should be a red flag right away. Like if
Ooh,
there is a God, God is ultimate love and goodness. So right away, if I'm wishing God were more generous, then I'm probably dealing with a figment of my imagination.
that is so, so poignant. I love that. When I was in the church, it felt like, it made sense. But then when I came out of it and I started thinking for myself, I realized very quickly it makes sense until you think about it. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, it's sort of like your family of origin. When everybody's family, good, bad, or ugly, everybody's family has things that they do that are just normal. That
Yeah.
when you meet, like maybe you start dating someone or you bring a friend home for a holiday, and they're like, that's weird, right? Like not everybody's family does that, and you're totally oblivious to how
Really?
weird your family is until somebody points it out to you. That's sort of how I feel about that. Like,
Yeah.
Richard Rohr says something like, this is a paraphrase, but you can't see what you were taught not to look for.
Mm, that's
And
good.
and for so many of us, we were actively taught not to look for. And I think the other problem with just dangling hell in front of people is it plays to our worst impulses, which is just to be sort of self-protective and to only care about what our experience is and to not care about like our place in the larger. It's a very American thing, right? It's a very American approach, which is to say that the thing that matters more than anything else is not how we leave the planet. It's not how we treat people. It's not feeding hungry people. It's making sure that after living a pretty, for me, privileged life, that I'll get even more privilege in the next one, which
Ooh.
plays to our worst impulses, our most selfish, our most egocentric impulses. And it doesn't call us to sort of our responsibility as a member of the human species on the planet, which I think is what good faith should do, right? It should call us to play
Right.
our role in the unfolding healing, restoration, and wholeness making of the world.
Wow. Amazing. You keep throwing out all this stuff, and I'm like, wait, I want to think about that for a second, but this is a conversation, so I'll have to listen to it later again and let myself, marinate a little bit. But wow, and thank you for saying all these things. Thank you. One thing I love, I've had several, like Ben Kramer has been on. I've, had Bethany. Had a couple of people who are pastors who've been on. And I love having pastors on because I'm like, I just wish your church was closer to where I live because I'd actually go. I would
Yeah.
go back, but there are people like you guys who are, you know, still making it happen just in a different way. How do you do this? Is this hard? I mean, obviously it's bringing CNN to your doorstep, so clearly something is catching, the attention of the media. So that means something's going on.
Yeah.
How are you doing with everything?
I mean, there are challenges in everything you do in life.
Yeah.
One of the challenges in the progressive world is when you take fear and certainty off the table, which are the two things that my religious upbringing gave me more than anything.
Yeah.
It was certainty. We're right. We know that we know we know we're right. We know that we know that we know where we're going to go when we die. And then the fear of, if you don't do what you're supposed to do, then you're going to get this bad. And what I've learned is that fear we don't need, because we don't make our best decisions ever when we're
Mhm.
responding. And certainty we can't have. So the two things that were the bedrock of my religious upbringing were something I don't need and something I can't have. And so when you remove those things, thankfully remove those things, it just creates, like, now people will participate and support and do all of that based on the impact and the benefit to their life, not based on something you're holding over them. So one of the benefits is that you no longer have hostages. You have actual human beings who are interested in being a part of something. And the downside is you have to figure out how it's a much smaller pool of people. And so how
Mhm.
do you make it sustainable? And those are always the ongoing challenges. I probably love parts of what I do now more than I ever have, uh,
Mhm.
because I'm really fortunate that at Grace Point, um, like, there's not a thing I can't talk about theologically.
Mhm.
There's not when we do question response days, like, I'm not like, oh, please don't ask about hell.
Yeah.
There's a certain joy about being able to um, talk and think and not have those boundaries and borders that were placed on us in more conservative circles. So
How did you get to that point where you like, do you remember the first time you were like, okay, you mentioned when you realized there was a deeper theology out there that
Mhm.
you wanted to explore. So what did that look like for you?
It looked like what a lot of people were doing who were thinking about this stuff in the early to mid 2000s, which is find ways to talk about it, but not explicitly, so that you don't completely lose your job.
Mhm.
Which means I learned over time that I'll never forget sitting down with somebody who was leaving the church, my last church, not Grace Point, who was leaving the church because something been saying for a decade, they finally understood it and asked me about it. And he said, I've been coming to this church for 10 years. I never knew you meant that. And I feel kind of betrayed. And I
Mhm.
realized that's a really valid response from him,
Mhm.
because I have uh, not been as explicit as I could have been on what I meant on this in order to protect myself and not. And so I just made a decision then and there. This was,
That makes
a
sense.
little more ago. I'm just going to be as blunt as I can. I mean, and so it started with me sitting down at the church I was at in a little small rural Kentucky town. That if Kentucky's red, whatever the deepest shade of red, this little town is. And I led this church there, which is really conservative, fundamental in its beliefs, to become affirming and progressive over the course of my 14, 15 years there. But it was challenging. So I sat down with our elders at the time, and I just said, I need to tell you everything I think at the moment. about anything that might make you want me to resign or that might make you want to fire me. And so I sat down and I just went, like all over like just here's everything, LGBTQ plus inclusion, atonement theory, all the. And I just ended by saying, look, I recognize that I'm changing the game here, and that this may not be a journey that this church needs to take, but it's a journey I have to take. So if you want me to resign, I'll resign.
Wow.
And to their credit, to a person, they said, no, we think this is a journey we should take.
Wow.
Now, a year later, like there was one of them left. Um, and I'll never forget being on the phone with Brian McLaren during this process, and Brian telling me the hardest part of this for you is not going to be the people who disagree with you and call you a heretic and leave. It's the people who agree with you and want you to succeed, but they call you for coffee and have coffee and tell you that because it's weird in the small town for their family, they have to leave. And I was like, nope, I know these people. We're in it to win it together. It's not going to happen. And a year later, I was like, you were spot on. The people who asked me to coffee, who were like, we love this, we support it, we're cheering you on, we're just not coming or giving money anymore because it's making things weird at Thanksgiving. And that was the hardest part. But
Boy, you know how many people just went, oh my word, that is my life. People who are deconstructing this is, it's like, why would anybody choose to do this if it didn't feel like it was the absolute right thing to do? Because
if you weren't fighting for your life, why would you do this? Like
right.
people, you decided you wanted to deconstruct so that you could change your perspective on sexuality, or so that you could change your perspective on whatever, or to get, my favorite is when they're like, you just did this to get rich and popular. When does either happen? Like I'm still waiting for one of the two.
Hello. I just did it. I just did my first episode of the year. And I was like, so one of the things I've learned is that people in the deconstruction, like content creation space, don't make money like at all. We're paying to do this, just so you know. Like we're not getting rich, we're not making money. Some of us literally are paying to do it because we believe in it so much.
That's right.
And should we be making, I don't know. All I know is that I'm going to do it whether I am or not, just because it matters. And I think we need voices. And my husband said something to me. He said, I feel like the people who have the voices right now are like, you've got the sickles and you're like creating a path so that people can walk down that path later. Like the hard work doesn't usually show the fruit. It is the aftermath of it. So, I think that's kind of cool when you look at it that way.
And it's super encouraging right now. I mean, of all the terrible things that 2016 gave us, it did create sort of a critical mass in this movement. And I can just remember, in 2006, going to lunch with a colleague, trying to figure out if he was safe or not for me to talk about what I was actually thinking. And being like, so who are you reading? And like, based on his response, be like, okay. And
Rob Bell?
Right. Like, Rob Bell, Brian McLaren, Mark Sport, Donna Butler Bass. And I just remember like trying to feel. And so now the fact that there are space, like that's such a gift.
Oh yeah.
It's still difficult. It's still painful. The relational carnage that pursuing an authentic faith experience for yourself can create is real. But also, I mean, I don't really talk to anybody who's like, I wish I'd have just taken all the questions out, looked at them, and put them back without because again, this is not a thing you choose. This is something that picks you in a kind of way. Like it just happens to you, and then you have to decide how you approach it. If even that's it, I mean, like I never felt like I'm making a choice here.
Yeah.
I felt like everything is unraveling around me here. I've got to do something.
That's exactly, you described it perfectly. It felt like an unraveling, and it felt like a violation. It was like, what are you doing? Like, don't think about this. What do you do? How many times have I been tempted to go, forget it all. I'm just going back in because it's easier just to believe what I'm told. It's easier because then you have your community, the more that I'm realizing, like the more guests that I'm having on who are sharing their stories. I had Reza Aslan on who talked about the sociology of religion. And I was like, oh my word, no wonder this is so hard. This is our community. This is our purpose, our meaning, everything, and I remember thinking, what's going to happen if one of us dies if we're not in a church? Who's going to do the funeral? Who's going to, what are we going to do? Like all of the stupidest things were, and I'm like, was that what was keeping me there for so long? Was I just that afraid to
Mm,
lose that? And I'm like, why is that? I don't know. Like, why is that so important to people that you believe exactly the same way? And if you don't, you're this or that, or you're filed away, or you have a demon, like what is that, Josh? Do you know what I mean?
I mean, it's a desire to belong, and
Yeah.
when belonging is contingent, then you have a real problem. I often will tell people, I think that time on Sunday in churches all around the world when people are reciting a creed
Mhm.
together, there's some of them who really believe it. There are some of them who are just faking it because they
Yeah.
have
Oh,
to,
of
right?
course. Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
they're belong. And I often wonder, like, are people looking around the room wondering, do they really believe it, or are they looking around the room going, like, can they tell I'm totally faking it here, that I actually don't believe? Because there's something about, to me, like this idea that the most important thing for us is that we all agree
Mhm.
on the, like, that can't be the point. During this last election, I'd shared a post that I was voting for Kamala Harris, and a prominent Southern Baptist pastor who had been vocally outspoken against Trump and that he was going to support Harris shared my tweet. And I
Oops.
thought, oh, that's cool. Like, we have very little in common theologically, except that we're from the same tradition, in the
Right.
beginning. And he's looking past our theological differences
Mm.
because we're like, Trump is such a clear and present danger. We have to.
Mhm.
And then somebody commented like, "Hey brother, this guy's a heretic. You may want to and he unshared it immediately."
No.
I had for one beautiful moment, because I think we have to be able to find a way, um, to, especially on big things, like, even if we can't agree across the board, we got to find a way to move the planet forward in a healthy way for everybody. And just, I don't know, it was a sort of disappointment. I thought, like, that was a hopeful example
Yeah.
that maybe on certain things we can find some common ground, but then because of my particular beliefs around this and this, no, we actually can't,
Yeah.
even though we had common ground.
It's just fear. It's fear.
Because
Man.
if people in his church knew he shared a tweet of an affirming pastor who doesn't take the Bible literally as inerrant and infallible,
Mhm.
it could cost him his job. I know that fear. I used to
Oh,
live
I
in
do too.
fear.
Yeah.
It's a very real thing.
Wow. I feel like I'm looking at a tree with a million branches and I'm not sure which question to ask. I have so many. So as a pastor, um, what would you say to somebody who, because like I have a feeling there's a new thing. I mean, every election cycle, more people begin to deconstruct because they go, yeah, I don't think so. And because I just think there's something really gross about politics and religion getting into bed together and trying to make an impact, And so people may be leaving now. You've got somebody who's, I call them invisibles. There are people who are online kind of looking for voices that resonate. There are people who are hurting. They're starting to question and they're starting to realize the answers aren't what they thought they would be. What would you say to someone like that?
Well, first of all, I would say pay attention to your intuition on this.
Yeah. But
It's
that's something we're taught not to do, Josh.
all
You
right.
know,
I
that's
did a
the
whole
weird thing.
sermon. Was it last year or the year before, where I just talked about, that verse that says, like, the heart is deceitful above all things. Who can trust it? Like, no, that's not right. That's actually not right. Your heart, you can trust yourself on, to follow. I almost said follow your nose. What is
Yeah.
that? Fruit Loops.
Follow your nose. It always does.
And I think the Spirit is just as active at leading people out of institutional Christianity as she is pulling people into it.
Mm,
So I would say that, first of all, pay attention to what you're thinking and feeling. Pay attention to your intuition on this, and then I would say give yourself patience, because things actually, to quote the poet and prophet Mary Oliver, things take the time they take, and they do. And I just have sat over the last 20 years with so many people who are putting I should be here by now. I
mhm.
should, I shouldn't be thinking about that now. That shouldn't haunt me. I shouldn't have fear before I go to sleep about what if I go to hell when you know what I mean? I meet people all the time but uh, what I will tell people is, and I'll never forget meeting this woman. She had been a pastor's wife for decades. And she just came up to me after I'd finished speaking at an event, and she had a list of scriptures. And she said, I just need to go through these. Will you go through them with me?
Mm.
I just can't see them differently. And I said, hey, I'm happy to do that. I said, but before we do that, can I just say, and you don't need anyone's permission for this, but in case you think you need someone's permission for this, you have the permission for this to take the time it takes for you.
Mm.
There's not a there you're supposed to arrive at
Mm.
in the next 5 months. She had been a pastor's wife and been raised in church like 60 years. So 60 years you've been pumped with this.
Yeah.
It doesn't just muscle memory is a thing, even for your soul. And so like it doesn't just fix, it doesn't just change, it doesn't just, and even when you're putting in better information, different information, you believe something different. Like you would say, like, I know that God is not sending people to hell. I believe that with the core of my being. But when you've been dangled over the flames of hell your entire life, you can still feel the heat, even
Oh,
if
yeah,
there's
the
no fire.
claws get you. It's hard to get those claws off of you.
Yep. Yep.
It's such a deeply embedded fear. And as a mom, my fear wasn't so much for me because I was pretty certain that I meant it, quote unquote, when I said the prayer. So I was like pretty sure I was good. I was more worried about people I loved.
Yes.
It was
Yeah.
a constant sadness. And I mean, constant sadness.
Yeah.
It motivated everything I did, every relationship I had this underlying sadness to it that
Yeah.
is gone now that I have let go of that. I believe just um, very, very wrong teaching. It seemed to me like we were taking God and turning him into something. I mean, we were breaking the commandment of taking the Lord's name in vain, saying he said something he didn't say. But
Right.
I I just really I can't even explain with words. Like I could cry right now just thinking about like the freedom that I have now to just love people and to see them as beautiful and their journeys are beautiful and
That's right. Without the need to change them or
without
convert
the
them.
need or like the fear to
Yeah.
change them, like
Yeah.
constant, and it's gone. And these are tears of joy,
Yeah.
FYI.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
another thing I would say to those folks is that whatever, uh, when people say they're fully deconstructed, I'm like, that's quick.
yeah.
I'm
Is
not.
that a
I've been at
thing?
this for 20 some years. I'm not fully deconstructed. I'm always learning something new to change my mind about.
Yeah.
But whatever, so let's just say not at the end of this journey, but as you move along this journey, the most important thing will not be what you believe, like the doctrines that you hold on to. The most important thing will be who you become. And so I think we have spent most of our energy in Christianity trying to get people to believe certain things while completely ignoring the kind of people we've been becoming, which is how you end up 10 years ago this year with Donald Trump riding down a golden escalator, spouting all sorts of vile, misogynistic, racist things. And 80 some percent of evangelicals going, yeah, that's our guy. Because you can do that and still hold on to, Jesus died for my sins.
Yeah.
But you can't hold on to that and go, I'm living a Christ-like way of being in the world.
Yeah.
Those are different.
Yeah, that was the big mirror. That's what I call it. When Trump stepped up and we kind of as evangelicals, not we, but as evangelicals
Yeah.
stood behind it. I never did, and I always got in trouble for it. But I I literally it was like, "Do you see what I see, guys?" And
And
then
how
it
do you
was,
not?
"How do you not see it?" And if you see something like that in him, what else have you taught me that isn't true? That was what started my journey. I mean, it wasn't the thing. I mean, I think in 2007 being on Survivor, all of that started my questioning. But
Yeah.
then 2016, I was out of the church. I couldn't do it.
Yeah.
Um, and I was a heretic. I mean, people called me a heretic and an apostate and a Judas and all the things. And I mean, these are people I really cared about.
Yes. And it's painful. And I mean, the reality is the same people who told me in 1999, was it, that you can't vote for Al Gore because he was the vice president of Bill Clinton, who was immoral,
Yeah.
are now the same people saying, well, we don't elect a pastor,
Right.
we elect a
Yeah.
president. And to see how quickly and how just how they built their house on sand on this one,
Yeah.
and do not even have the decency to feel a little bit of shame about it.
None. It was
I'm
almost like
all
we
about eliminating
tried.
shame, all about eliminating shame. But you should probably on this one be like,
I kind of messed up. And I do really respect, because there are some people in the church that are like, listen, I don't I don't like the guy. Like I don't.
yeah,
I just it's all about policy or whatever. I get that. I understand, but it just the overwhelming message from the church and where I was at was if you don't support him, you're probably not really saved because you
right.
can't see what we see. And then it was just like one of those disillusioning, like, maybe I am a heathen. Maybe, maybe I never really meant it like I thought I did. You start to question your own beliefs. And I didn't feel like that was the case. What about you? Did you ever like come to a place where you were like questioning, like, and thinking, is there something wrong with me? Or did
Oh,
you just always have that
I don't know how
confidence?
you don't at some
Yeah.
point wonder like how do I see this, but
Mhm.
like 99% of the people around me don't. It has to be like, like
What's
if
wrong with
it
me?
keeps happening and you're at the center of it, at some point you have to look at yourself,
I'm the common denominator.
right? But I just here's one of the questions people still ask me is like, yeah, but what if you're wrong?
Mhm.
You know, and that question no longer haunts me.
Mm-mm.
I can look at that question and say, look, I am wrong about some things. I don't know what they are. If I did, I would change them now. And when
Mhm.
I find out, I'm happy. I want to change them. But here's the thing I'm confident about, that where I'm wrong, it is not because I've developed a God that is too loving, too kind, too compassionate, just too good. And the real God is kind of a jerk. Where I've been wrong, it's because I have not fully leaned into or trusted that God is really that loving, that generous, that compassionate, and that kind.
Mhm.
So it's because I haven't gone far enough. It's not because I've gone too far. And I feel really, really at peace with that. And
I
so,
love I love that description. There is something about yeah, I tell people all the time, I said one of the scriptures, honestly, it was a scripture that got me deconstructing was that First John 4. There's no fear in perfect love. Perfect love casts out fear. Fear has to do with punishment.
yeah,
And that was the moment I realized I've been afraid of everything.
yeah,
And it's like, how do I experience perfect love if I'm afraid? I'm not experiencing perfect love. What have I been experiencing?
that's right.
And I am experiencing perfect love now.
Yeah.
There is no fear. And I can tell you verbatim, there is no fear in perfect love. Perfect love casts out fear. Now, when people go, what if you're wrong? I'm like, okay, if I'm wrong, you know, I don't know. As a parent, I look at God and I'm like, oh my word, the love that God has for us is beyond what I even feel for my kids, and that blows my mind.
I'm always
There
like, I can't be better at this than God.
no, no, no. There's no way. There's no way. So if God's love for us is even greater than my love for my kids, I can promise you right now, I would never throw my kids in eternal conscious torment because they believed something different.
Right.
It's so like,
Or because they didn't praise me enough. Like,
yeah, yeah, yeah. Ew.
can you imagine if every morning I made my kids get up and sing songs about how great is our dad? Like, how weird would that be? Like, people would say, hopefully, man,
Uh,
you may be a
you're
narcissist,
messy.
right?
You may be a
You need
narcissist.
therapy. I mean, we all need therapy, but you
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
really, really need
You
therapy.
really, and your kids definitely need.
And here's the deal: the best part about being a parent to my kids, and so I have a 15-year-old. I have our twins turned 9 yesterday, and then I
Aw,
have a kiddo who's about to be 8, and a kiddo who is 8. So we have a lot of little kids.
wow.
The best part of being a parent for me
Mhm.
is when my kids aren't even thinking about me, but are enjoying themselves.
Yes.
Watching them laugh and play and not sit around going like, are we disappointing dad right
Mhm.
now? No, I would not want them to function that way in the world. I want them to function like, well, if dad shows up, then we're in big trouble. Even when they're, I think about this all the time. We have a teenager, he's going to drive next year. I want to be the parent. We want to be the sets of parents that our kids, if they're out doing something that we maybe would rather them not have done, and they're with their friends and their friends can't call home, we want to be the parents that our kids know, oh, we'll call mom and dad. I mean, we may have a conversation at some point, but their number one thing is going to be making sure we're okay
And safe, yeah.
and safe. And if that's me,
Yeah.
then I am not the best parent in the world. If that's me,
Mhm.
surely this ultimate reality that we, fumble around and feebly put the word God on, surely it's better than that.
Yeah. It's hard for people to let go of the dogma, though. I do think there is something, innately human, maybe, where we want to cling to something. We need a truth. We need to make sense of the world, and when something offers those answers and those ideas that make sense, and we okay, boom, check that box, I'm good. There is something really comfortable about that. How do you handle,
No,
because it is sometimes a little uncomfortable not having certainty, but
no,
and it's funny because they say faith is believing something that you don't really know, but you just believe, but they
right.
are so certain. So I don't know
Yeah.
which is true. Like,
Yeah. I think that there is a primal human anxiety around the fact that there's a lot that determines what happens to us that's out of our control. I mean,
mhm,
I think if you go back anthropologically, sociologically, you go back into our past, like where did the idea of sacrifice come from? I mean, it's us realizing as a species, if we don't get enough rain, the crops don't grow. If we get too much rain, the crops don't grow. They die. If and we're so dependent on all these forces outside of us, we have to develop ways of communicating with the unseen
mhm,
to make sure it's on our side. And so the primal drive for humanity around religion is not wonder, it's anxiety. Um, and John Shelby Spong, in one of his books, has this great line where he says, actually, what religion can offer us is not certainty in the face of anxiety, but it's the courage to face the uncertainty that's
mhm.
making us anxious. Because there's so much we don't know, right? And there are those times when I'm falling asleep at night and I'm, closing my eyes and I'm going, there'll be a moment when I'm not here. And then all of a sudden it's like, well, I'm awake. Will I be anywhere? Where will I be? What will that be like? Is there a light? And you just start
Mhm.
spiraling on this because the anxiety is around the unknown.
Yeah,
Um, and I think that what faith can do is give us some courage that in spite of the unknowing, we can realize that how we spend our time here, if this is it, if there's not an afterlife, how we spend our time here is extremely important.
it's important.
If there is an afterlife, how we spend our time here is extremely important, not
Important.
because of our afterlife destination, but because of the world that we leave to future generations. It's really,
Mhm.
really important. And so for me, some of that has been just coming around. I don't know what's going to happen to me when I die. There's so much uncertainty, but I do know that the God I'm coming to trust is good and love. And if Marcus Borg had this great line where he's like, I don't know if there's an afterlife or not, but what I do know is what I trust is that we die into God. Uh,
Mhm.
and that the God who has held us up through our lives is the same God who will hold us up through death. And I love the line. He's like, I don't know any more than that, but that's enough. And that's, so I've been able to say to my faith in some ways, like, I know your job is um, not to rid me of all my anxieties around the unknown, because you can't do that. It's sort of like when people want the Bible to be an answer book. We're asking things of the Bible that the Bible's not designed to give us. We want our faith to be the bedrock, the rock, the certainty that's just not. Certainty doesn't exist.
Mhm.
But what faith can do is inspire us to courage and conviction, and to be people who show up in the world in a certain kind of way. And if we really are talking about faith, then leaving the results of that into the hands of God, and trusting that if God is good and God is love, whatever happens is going to be okay.
I don't know what's next. None of us do. We can say we know, but we don't.
You don't know.
And but one thing I do know is it's gonna be good whatever it is. Even if it's just complete rest forever. That sounds
If it's
amazing.
being brought back into the source we came from, fantastic.
Yeah.
It can't be bad.
Yeah.
It can't be bad.
No. It can't because but I think where it goes wrong is when we try to create a God based on our anxieties and our fears and a narrative that lines up with that, and that's hard.
Yeah.
And so, okay, I have a question. I love this question. It's so fun because I love to hear people's perspectives. So, Jesus, let's talk about Jesus. Who is Jesus in your life? Like, how do you see Jesus now that you're more progressive?
Yeah. Huge fan. Love him.
Huge fan, right?
I
Same.
love Jesus. I love Jesus now. That's when the people in my life who worry about me and they're like, I'm worried that you're not saved. I'll just say something like, I love Jesus now more than ever.
Yeah, same.
And there was a point where I would have thought, 20 years ago, I would have said, in 5 years, I won't be a Christian. And now I'm like,
Mm.
I'm a lifer. And my perspective has really changed on Jesus, on who he is doctrinally. I'll just say I'm way more interested in the Jesus of history than the Christ of faith these days,
Mm.
because what makes the Christ of faith meaningful, this person Jesus became after his death, what makes that meaningful is the life that produced it. Like, what kind of life leads to the people who knew him best walking away going, yes, he's with us. And in some ways, when we were in his presence, we felt like we were in the presence of God. That to me is like, this is a remarkable human life.
Mhm. It's
Um,
worth noting.
right. And worth emulating and following. And so, for me, Jesus is, and it's always fun when people are like, do you think Jesus is the Son of God? Well, it depends
Oh,
on what.
they're trying to I know exactly what you're talking about. Like,
Right?
it's the
But
trap
do you,
questions.
do you think by Son of God, I mean that if Jesus, we're on the Maury Povich show and it's like, God is the Father. No, I don't believe that at all. Do I believe Jesus is the Son of God in Jewish and Roman theological terms? Whereas, it's sort of like Jesus is the rightful ruler, is what that would have meant, that Jesus is the one we should follow. For me, absolutely, I believe that's true. I don't think it has anything to do with Jesus' biology. I think we've taken ancient stories that they would have read symbolically and read them literally,
Mm.
in many ways. Do I think that God needed Jesus to die to satiate some sort of bloodlust and satisfy God's hurt feelings? I don't think so at all. I think Jesus quite literally died because of our sins, because of our addiction to violence and injustice as a species. It looks different, but I'm just more enthralled and captured by the Jesus story than I've ever been in my entire life. And I ruined so many parties by bringing him up. Not in a I want to convert you kind of way, but like, hey, I
No.
just learned this last week about this story. Isn't this really cool? And they're like, oh, here he goes again.
Here he goes again. Well, why do you think he came? Because people ask me that. They're like, well, if you don't believe he came to die for your sins, why do you think he came? I have an
Well,
answer, but I want to hear yours.
one of the reasons he came is the same reason you and I did, which is we were born. We didn't have much say in the matter. Other people made decisions, and here we are, like it or not.
Yeah.
But when you talk about the meaning of Jesus' life, I would say for me, I think Jesus led a movement that was a resistance movement against empire.
Mhm.
And I think Jesus was launching a new creation in the middle of the old. And here's what I mean. I think Jesus had this realization that violence is not the way we're going to change the world, because there will always be somebody with bigger, better weapons and more skill with them. And that's not how God brings God's dream into the world, is through violence. So I think Jesus said, what we're going to do is I'm going to form a community where we live as if the future were already here. We're going to live in this community as if heaven were on earth. What would that be like? It would be everybody having enough. It would be embracing those who have been excluded. It would be, casting out. And I think when I read about demons in the New Testament, I always think it's a stand-in for empire and the effects of empire. But it would be ridding ourselves of this sort of predatory empire and beginning to live. So I think Jesus was modeling a way to live. And I think that he was successful. I think Paul's innovation wasn't a new religion. I think Paul's innovation was there are Gentiles who have been affected by the empire just as much as we have. So what if we find ways to band together and create bigger
Mm.
communities of resistance? I think they were so good at it that at some point the Romans looked around and said, if we don't co-opt this, it's going to win the day.
Mm.
Like this is, we're in trouble. We better figure out a way to take over. And by golly, they did it, and they did it brilliantly. And the Christian church has never been the same. And
Wow.
so, when I think about Jesus, I think of somebody who's showing us the way humans ought to live together in community,
Boom.
care, which also, this just goes back to sort of the question people often will ask. And I used to always feel like such a bad leader because I didn't have an answer to the question sometimes, like, what's the vision for your church? And I would just be going like, I think it's just to create a space where people are loved and embraced and belong and can learn and pursue. Like, I think it's just to be a church, right? But then I finally realized, no, their question is they're asking you about capitalism.
Yeah.
They're asking you about, like, how does your church take the practices of empire and do them really well? And I just realized one day I have no interest in that, because I think it is the antithesis of what the Jesus movement was.
Mm.
And what we have been given is not even, you often say it's a cheap imitation or a shoddy imitation. It's not even it's a really horrendous imitation that has at times caused untold damage and harm in the world.
Oh, yeah.
And I get
Wars
why
have been fought. I mean, people have died.
there's often we'll say Christianity and the Bible have a body count.
Mhm.
And, so I think that, of course, people want to bail out on that. Why wouldn't people want to bail out on that? Some of us have decided that it's, this religion is so massive and so powerful and so wealthy that if we lose all voices of conscience, can you imagine what it's going to do unchecked?
Mm.
And so I think, I'm grateful for those of us who have stayed in and are trying to make change there. I also get why for some people it's been too damaging and too harmful and they must leave. Then I also understand that when I talk to people about the Bible or theology or faith, what I often will find is a lot of people who, not everybody who's left, but some people who left are carrying a grief around with them because they feel like this thing they loved and that mattered to them had been taken away from them. And so I sort of see, like, my work is if I can help give it back
Mm.
in a way that's not toxic and harmful, but a way that inspires wonder and invites us to live our best possible lives. I want to help people do that. Not because they need it. No one needs a particular religion to be a good person or to do good things in the
No.
world.
Mhm.
But for me, Christianity is just sort of my mother tongue. It's, I've dabbled in other languages. I can read some of the ancient biblical languages. I know, had enough German to remember the profanity. But even today, I could curse in German, but if I stub my toe, that's coming out in English.
Yeah.
When I pray in English because that's my language of
Native.
comfort at home,
Yeah.
not because it's better than other languages. I feel that way about my faith. Christianity is my mother tongue. It's how I relate to God. I love learning other languages. I've been so enriched and inspired by things I've learned from my Buddhist friends, my Muslim friends, but it always makes me glad to also come back home and speak my language in ways that I find meaningful. So I think that I want to help people who want that, who need that, because what has happened is they've had something taken from them,
Mhm.
and it's tragic, and it doesn't have to be that way.
They feel lied to. They feel like they lied because they taught it. There is so much. Like I help coach people through deconstruction, and one of the biggest things is the grief process, like helping
Well,
people through that, like grieve the grief because it's real and it's hard. And it's probably the thing that a lot of people just run away from. They're just like, I don't even want to, like, it doesn't even deserve my grief, but it really does. This
which is
was
why there's anger.
your, yeah,
There's a
exactly.
stage of grief, like
Yeah.
being angry about this.
It's ungrieved grief. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
And so it makes total sense. But yeah, keeping people just in a place of hope when it feels like there is none, helping them see that there are other ways of looking at this, and that's okay.
and
You
that's
know,
okay,
eh, yeah, and the hard thing is you're so taught that any other way of looking at it is wrong
right?
and evil and heretical or whatever. I mean, I remember when Rob Bell came out and did his thing, he was all Numa and I was like all in. I was like, yeah, yeah. And then he like writes Love Wins and I was like, I didn't even read it because I was told not to. But
Yeah.
I was like, oh my gosh, how did this man just completely betray the faith? I was
I was
horrified.
so relieved when that came out
Yes,
because I was
yeah,
like,
I'm not alone.
I decided this hell thing doesn't work,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
I didn't know anybody else. And when Rob played such a role in my early development,
Hmm.
he wrote that book. I was like, oh,
Yeah.
and then I saw him get canceled by John Piper and others, and I was like, oh, whew,
Oh, this is for real.
this is
Yeah,
for
he did. He got all canceled, but he also kind of made his own thing, and I did finally read that book and it's freaking awesome. And as I'm reading it, I'm like, if I would have read this when it came out, it would have
yeah.
really made me think. And that is exactly why I was told by all of my teachers not to read it.
Yeah, Leslie, I think one of the things that happens too is there's this embarrassment that comes from all the things I used to say
Hmm.
now. Like I can go back in the tape in my brain and remember things I've said and just be humiliated that I said
Oh,
that with
same.
other people in a room that had air in it and all of that. But I think it's important to also note that some dear friends that helped me process some of this, what was so helpful is to say, actually, the road to wholeness and healing and all of that is not through distancing ourselves from ourselves,
Mhm.
but it's to see, like, if you imagine that we're like a tree, you cut a tree open, there are all these rings that
Yeah.
show growth. Like all the versions of us are still in there,
Hmm.
and they all played a role in shaping who we became. Like now, 20 years on, I can look back at my upbringing and say, so much of it was, you know, messed up religiously. People were also doing what they knew to do.
Hmm.
They weren't malicious. They were just
No.
doing under the fear of God and hell what they
Yeah.
were taught to do. And I look back and I think, but I'm really grateful now that they at least gave me a love for the Bible, that
Yeah.
it's given me a passion for my life that I've spent my life investing in very differently. They would say I probably don't love the Bible, but I do, and I'm grateful that they gave me. And also being able to realize, like, there was the 20-year-old preacher, know-it-all preacher kid version of me who's still in there, and that energy's still in there, but it's been redirected. But he doesn't get to drive the bus,
Yeah.
right?
He's in the back seat now.
He's in the back seat. He's taking orders, but realizing, like, no, we don't have to, like, yes, I'm embarrassed about some things I said in the past. I'm
Mhm.
embarrassed about things I believed and how I treated people as a result of my certainty. But I need to, figuring out, okay, the only thing I can do, I can't go back and redo that. What I can do is seek to move forward in a better, in a more Christ-like, compassionate, kind
Yeah.
way, and not let that 20-year-old preacher kid drive the bus anymore. He doesn't need to.
Well, and
Uh,
not be angry at him, you know?
he
I
was
think
doing
we
what
all
he knew to do.
he was doing his best with what he knew. And I feel the same about I call her Sister Christian, my old self. She was yeah, they called me that on Survivor, so I kinda use that to say that's who I used to be, and it's not even that I'm not a Christian anymore. I am. I mean, Christians would probably say I'm not a Christian, or some Christians, um, but I know my heart, I think. I feel pretty confident that I'm doing the best I can with what I know. I just know a little more now.
That's right.
And I'm not afraid of any of it.
That's
So
right.
that feels right. But this is all part like what you just talked about, Josh, is so why I do this podcast. Is because what we're all doing is honoring our journeys, even the ugly parts, even the embarrassing parts, even the parts we wish we could take back. It's like it's all part of the journeys that we've taken. And
Yeah.
I love what you're doing. Thank you for what you're doing. And I honor your journey, Josh. You're making an impact and yeah, maybe not capitalistically, but you are making such an impact, giving people hope.
As a pastor, sometimes the best I can do is provide hospice for someone's faith,
Yeah.
meaning to help them leave it in a way that's dignified and at peace. And
Oh,
I
I
do
love that.
that. I've helped people leave Christianity, and I see it as pastoral care. But I
That
also
is
help people
beautiful.
come to life again, and there are folks in our community who came to us, and we were their last stop before what John Shelby Spong called the Church Alumni Association. Um, and they found a reinvigorated, renewed faith that didn't cause them to check their head or their heart at the door, and it didn't cause them to hate anybody. It actually caused them to love people more. And so that's the work I feel committed to. It's work. And thank you for your work. I mean, my goodness, you're doing such beautiful stuff in the world, and
Thank
you bring
you.
people together and helping people. It's just, it
I
really
love
takes,
it.
doesn't it?
It's the most rewarding thing I've ever done. And it's so funny. I was just talking to um, one of my clients, and they were saying, thank you for what you're doing. And I was just like, I was so afraid to start doing this because I was told over and over again, if you leave the church, God's going to rip your gifts away.
yeah,
And, he didn't, or she, or they.
yeah,
God did not rip my gifts away. God is still working through me and speaking and he's doing it through all of us, or she. I feel like that's the thing that we really just met. That was I was so afraid. I wasn't going to be able to speak anymore. I wasn't going to be able to talk and encourage people. And what am I going to talk about? Where's my foundation if the Bible doesn't mean what I thought it meant?
yeah.
I was really scared. And I'm telling you, I had nothing to be afraid of. I am still absolutely connected to the divine. The divine is absolutely connected to me. It doesn't, it's not a set of beliefs. It just is. If you have breath, you are connected, period. You know,
Born connected.
born
Not
connected.
born disconnected, not born sinners, not
Yeah.
born connected to God. And I'll just say this too: when people tell me, like they tell you, you're not really a Christian, it happens
Yeah.
every day of my
Yeah.
life.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
One of my stock responses is, "I'm afraid that decision is above your pay grade,
Yeah.
because you aren't the one who gets to decide who is and isn't in."
Well, and it's like, okay, you can think whatever you like. It does not affect my life
I'm gonna keep loving
anymore.
Jesus over here. You
Yeah,
can't
I'm
stop.
just gonna keep trying to emulate Jesus's life and love and
Yeah.
you just include people and embrace people. I'm just gonna live my life. And if I get to heaven and God says you loved a little too hard, I'm gonna send you to hell now. I'll be like, okay. If that's the truth, and I don't believe it is, I will take my punishment.
If God is what they told us, then I think we should all choose hell in protest.
Yeah. Yeah.
The good news, actual real good news, is I think that God is a product of our worst fears,
Mhm.
not our highest hopes. And I think the reality that, and I often like to say, the reality that we try to put the word God on, because I think God is so much bigger than those three letters.
Mhm.
That reality is
Mm.
way better
Way
than we can
better.
possibly ask or imagine. And that, I'm good with that.
Me too. Well, listen, guys, I'm going to put all the links to get Josh's books. And here's what I wanted to kind of give this a little kick. If you, and a lot of people I work with in coaching are like, I really want to start a small group, of people who are searching, who are questioning, but I don't know what to do. I don't have any idea how to do this.
Yeah.
So there are certain books that I recommend, and I like to recommend yours, Context,
Oh,
because you
thank
have a
you.
leader's guide. And
Yeah.
that is so helpful if you feel like, oh, I'm just not a leader. Yeah, you are. You just do what this book says. You'll
There's
be
a DVD too, which I've yet to
just
watch,
push play.
uh, but where I talk at you for 10 minutes before
Yeah, but
each.
like if you're afraid of, I think the whole point is don't be afraid to take that step to make a small group. And there are so many resources out there and of like things that you can do that, little courses you can take together that just make you think a little deeper. And so I would highly recommend Context, putting scripture in its place. Maybe get the leader guide, but there's also Bible stories for grown-ups. And I think we can do a pre-order for parables, right?
Yeah, it's less than a month away. It comes out February 4th,
Ooh,
um,
okay.
which
That's exciting.
I'm about to start sharing the endorsements that I got for this one. I'm really excited. I deviated from some standard interpretations on some of these, but
No,
for
I'm just kidding.
historical reasons.
Yeah.
for historical contextual reasons.
Right, right.
I had some friends who are New Testament scholars who were very kind. So I'm excited for people to read this. I'm sure some people are going to hate it, but that's the truth of anything, right? Like some people are
Yeah.
going to love it, some people are going to hate it.
Do you have a subtitle for that one, or is it just parables?
That's parables putting Jesus' stories in their place.
Oh, love it. Very cool. I'll put all these links so you can just click and find Josh and get his stuff and maybe start that small group. Who knows?
And if you do start a small group, send me an email. I pop into those all the time virtually. I love it.
Do you
So
really? Oh, that's so fun.
all over
I'm
the
getting
country,
ready to
all over the
start one.
world, actually. I was with some people in Paris not too long ago who are going through one of my books.
Oh,
And
that's so cool.
yeah,
Well, I'm getting ready to start one here in Wasatch County in Utah because there is none over here. Um, and I have that on my list. So I'll make sure to let you know and we'll have you
please do.
pop in and say hi. Most of the people who leave religion here in Utah are ex-Mormon.
Mhm.
But you know what? I'm finding we have more alike than we have
Oh, very
different.
much so.
And really we're all just seeking connection and community and love. That's it. So
That's right.
anyway, well, thank you so much for being here today, Josh. This has been amazing. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you just have an amazing week. Thank you very much for
Thank
joining us.
you. This has been an absolute blast. We could talk for another 3 hours and I'd be very happy.
I know. Do we have to end? Yeah, we do.